Walter Bramble and the Lantern Keeper's Journal. Chapter 1. A Book Without a Title. The clock on Walter Bramble's mantelpiece chimed 9 times. It was not a loud clock. Walter did not care for loud clocks. This one had a gentle, thoughtful chime, as though it were clearing its throat politely before reminding the house that another hour had arrived. Walter looked up from his breakfast and smiled. Outside, rain drifted softly across the window. It was not heavy rain, not the sort that rattled gutters or rushed along pavements. It was a quiet rain, a silvery rain, the sort that made rooftops shine and turned the world beyond the glass slightly blurred and dreamlike. Walter sat at his small kitchen table with a pot of tea, 1 slice of toast, and a notebook in which he sometimes wrote down thoughts that occurred to him during the morning. Today's thought read, "Some days feel as though they are waiting for a story." He tapped the end of his pencil against the page, considered adding more, then decided that the sentence was quite enough as it was. Walter Bramble lived alone in a small Victorian terraced house. It had 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, narrow stairs, old floorboards and windows that allowed in just enough light to make dust visible on sunny days. Walter liked the house very much. It was not grand, but then Walter did not require grandeur. He required quiet corners, bookshelves, a comfortable chair, and a kettle that worked reliably. After breakfast, he washed his cup and plate, wiped the worktop, folded the tea towel, and checked the small row of plants on the kitchen windowsill. The basil looked perfectly happy. The parsley looked doubtful, as it often did. Walter gave it a little water. "There we are," he said. He buttoned his dark coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, took his umbrella from the stand by the door, and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet brick, rainwater, and distant bread from the bakery. Walter's walk to the library took 5 minutes, though he rarely hurried. He had taken the same route for so many years that every shop front, every garden wall, and every uneven paving stone felt like part of a familiar sentence. He passed the bakery first. Golden light glowed inside. Trays of loaves were cooling behind the counter, and the windows had misted at the edges. A woman in a blue apron was arranging iced buns in careful rows. Walter gave a small wave. She waved back. Next came the flower shop, where buckets of flowers stood beneath a striped awning. The rain had gathered on the petals of pink roses and white lilies, making them appear freshly polished. A little further along stood an antique shop. Its window display changed every week. Today it held 3 brass candlesticks, a chipped blue vase, a box of postcards, and a row of old clocks. Walter paused, as he often did, to look at them. He liked old clocks. They reminded him that time was not merely something that passed. It was something that gathered. It gathered in houses, in photographs, in books, in objects handled by people long gone. He wondered who had once owned the clocks, who had wound them, who had listened to them late at night, who had glanced at them while waiting for someone to come home. Walter smiled faintly and continued walking. At the end of the street stood the library. It was an old building, more than 100 years old, with dark red brickwork and tall windows set in stone frames. It was not large. It had no grand staircase outside, no pillars, no marble entrance hall. The sign above the door leaned very slightly to one side, and the brass handle had been polished by generations of hands. To Walter it was the finest building in the town, perhaps in the world. Because inside the library were doors, not ordinary doors, book doors, dream doors, memory doors. Some opened onto deserts, some onto forests, some onto snowy kingdoms, some onto quiet rooms where a single secret had been waiting for years to be discovered. And every day Walter Bramble visited the library, chose a book, and allowed himself to be carried wherever that book wished to take him. He shook his umbrella outside, folded it neatly, and stepped in. The smell greeted him first. Old paper, dust, wood polish, a little damp wool from the coats of visitors. And beneath it all, the deep, comfortable scent of stories. The librarian looked up from the desk. She was placing returned books onto a trolley. "Good morning, Walter." "Good morning." "Wet enough for you?" "Just enough," said Walter. "A rainy day improves a library." The librarian smiled. "I have always thought so." Walter hung his coat on the usual peg. Then he stood for a moment in the entrance hall as he always did, allowing the library to settle around him. There were a few people inside already. A student sat at a desk with a laptop and a pile of reference books. An elderly man was reading the newspaper by the window. A young mother crouched beside the children's shelves, helping a small boy choose between a book about dinosaurs and a book about tractors. Walter liked seeing other readers. Each one had come looking for something different. Some wanted facts, some wanted comfort, some wanted escape. Some perhaps did not know what they wanted until they found it. Walter began his usual slow wander. He never rushed to choose a book. Rushing a book choice seemed to him like interrupting someone before they had finished speaking. He passed the travel shelves. A book about mountain villages caught his eye, but only briefly. He paused by poetry and opened a slim green volume, reading 3 lines about swallows and dusk before replacing it carefully. He examined history, natural science, biography, and maps. Nothing quite called to him. That did not worry Walter. The right book often waited in a quiet place. He climbed the narrow staircase to the upper gallery. Few visitors went there. The gallery contained older books, donated books, forgotten books, books whose subjects had gone slightly out of fashion, and books that had simply waited so long that nobody remembered they were there. The floorboards creaked beneath Walter's shoes. Rain whispered against the high windows. The gallery lamps glowed amber. Walter moved along the shelves with his hands clasped behind his back. He enjoyed this corner of the library. It felt as though the books were asleep and did not mind being gently awakened. He turned into the far aisle, where the shelves stood closer together and the light was dimmer. There, between a large volume on coastal navigation and a cracked red book called Traditions of the Northern Counties, Walter saw something unusual. A dark blue book sat slightly crooked on the shelf. It had no title on the spine, no author, no catalogue sticker, no library label. Only a small embossed lantern near the bottom edge of the leather cover. Walter reached for it. The moment his fingers touched the book, he paused. It felt warm, not hot. Not strange in an unpleasant way, simply warm, as though it had been resting near a fire. He drew it from the shelf. The leather was soft with age. The corners were worn pale. The little lantern mark was pressed deeply into the cover, and when Walter tilted it towards the lamp, it seemed to catch the light. "Well," he murmured. He carried the book to an old armchair near the gallery window. It was his favourite chair in the library. Its fabric was faded, its arms were smooth, and it had a slight dip in the cushion exactly where a reader needed one. Walter sat down, rested the book on his knees, and opened it. The first page was blank. The second page was blank too. On the third page, in elegant ink, were written the words, "Journal of Elias Finch, Keeper of the Coastal Lanterns." Beneath that, in smaller writing, May the lights never fail. Walter adjusted his spectacles. He turned the page. March 3rd. The sea was calm tonight, all lanterns burning clearly. Lantern 12 required new glass after last week's storm, but the memory remains safe. I am grateful. Walter read the entry twice. The memory remains safe. It was an odd phrase. He turned another page. March 7th. Fog before dawn. Lantern. 21 dimmed briefly, but recovered when I spoke the remembered words. The boy with the paper boat still smiles when the flame strengthens. I begin to understand that memories do not vanish all at once. They fade at the edges first. Walter leaned back in the chair. The rain touched the window beside him in soft, uneven rhythms. He turned more pages. The journal continued in the same careful handwriting. It described lanterns along a coast. Some stood on cliffs, some beside harbour walls, some near cottages, some on lonely beaches where no footprints remained after the tide. Again and again Elias Finch wrote of memories: a woman singing in a kitchen, a child flying a kite, a sailor returning home, two sisters laughing in an orchard, a winter evening by a fire, a grandfather teaching a boy to mend a fishing net. Each lantern seemed to hold one memory. Each memory required care. Walter read slowly, with growing interest. At first the entries were calm and orderly. Then, many pages later, the handwriting changed. The letters became hurried. Ink blotted at the ends of words. May 14th. 3 lanterns faded tonight. I restored 2. The third resisted me. The memory within it was almost gone. I saw only a yellow door, rain on cobbles, and someone waiting beneath an archway. I could not recover the face. Walter turned the page. May 16th. The heart lantern is weaker. Walter stopped. The heart lantern. He liked the sound of it, though it troubled him too. He read on. If the heart lantern fails, the coast will go dark. If the coast goes dark, the memories will no longer have a place to rest. The next page was blank. So was the next. Walter turned several more. Blank. He frowned mildly. Then, just as he was about to close the book and look again at the cover, a line appeared on the page. Fresh, black ink formed slowly, letter by letter. Walter watched without alarm. He had seen enough unusual books to know that one must not panic simply because ink had begun to write itself. The message read, "If you are reading this, I need your help." A cool breeze moved through the gallery. Walter looked up. The library seemed quieter than before. The students typing had disappeared. The rustle of newspapers had faded. The small boy in the children's section no longer laughed over dinosaurs or tractors. Walter heard something else. Waves, very far away. He lowered his gaze to the journal. Another sentence appeared. The lights are fading. The scent of the library changed. Old paper gave way to salt. Dust gave way to sea air. The rain at the window became louder, then softer, then transformed into the steady hush of water moving over shingle. The shelves around Walter blurred. The lamp stretched into golden lines. The armchair beneath him seemed to loosen, becoming mist, becoming wind, becoming nothing at all. Walter held the journal carefully. A moment later, the library vanished. He was standing on a coastal path. The sky above him was vast and grey. The sea stretched to his right, restless and silver, rolling towards dark rocks far below. White foam opened and closed along the shore. Gulls drifted in the wind like scraps of paper. Behind him rose steep grassy hills. Ahead the path curved along the cliff, and along that path stood lanterns, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each mounted on an iron post, each containing a small golden flame. Some burned steadily, some flickered, some were almost dark. Walter looked down at himself. He still wore his coat and scarf. His shoes were quite unsuitable for a cliff path, though they appeared to have become less polished and more practical without asking permission. He opened the journal. New writing appeared. "Welcome to Lantern Coast. Follow the lights." Walter closed the book gently. "Well then," he said, "that seems clear enough." He began to walk. The first lantern stood near a bend in the path, overlooking a cove where waves slid in and out over smooth stones. Its flame was weak, the glass was clouded. Walter stepped closer. He did not know what to do, but the journal seemed to warm beneath his hand. He opened it again. Every memory must be met kindly. Walter considered this. Then he placed one hand lightly against the lantern's iron frame. The flame lifted. Gold light spread through the glass. Inside the flame, an image appeared. A little girl stood in a meadow under a summer sky. She held a spool of string. Above her, a red kite tugged in the wind. Two adults watched nearby, laughing as the kite swooped and rose. The girl turned in a circle, delighted. The memory glowed brighter. Walter felt the warmth of sunlight on grass, though the cliff wind still moved around him. Then the image faded. The lantern burned steadily. Walter smiled. The journal fluttered open by itself. Lantern 1 restored, he continued. The second lantern stood beside an old wooden bench. Its flame was smaller than the first. Walter touched the frame. This memory showed an elderly man sitting beneath an apple tree, carving a small boat from a piece of wood. A young boy sat beside him, watching with enormous concentration. The old man handed him the finished boat. The boy held it as though it were treasure. The lantern brightened. The third showed a kitchen warm with lamplight. A woman dusted flour from her hands while a child stood on a chair, stirring a bowl far too vigorously. Both began laughing when flour rose in a cloud. The fourth held a winter evening. Two people sat by a fire with mugs in their hands. A dog slept at their feet. Snow pressed softly against the window outside. Walter moved from lantern to lantern. Each memory lasted only a few seconds. Each left behind a feeling. Warmth, belonging, laughter, return, forgiveness, hope. He began to understand something. These lanterns did not hold famous moments. They did not preserve coronations or battles or discoveries that would be written into history books. They held ordinary memories. But ordinary memories, Walter had long believed, were often the most important kind. A person might forget the exact year of a great event, yet remember perfectly the smell of soup on a rainy afternoon, or the way someone once said their name with kindness, or the sound of footsteps returning along a hallway. The coast grew dimmer as the day moved towards evening. Walter walked on. At times the path rose high above the sea. At times it dipped towards little coves where fishing boats rested on the shingle. The lanterns stood everywhere, on rocks, on posts, on walls, beside gates, near old cottages with dark windows. Some memories came easily. Others trembled before returning. One lantern showed only a blue ribbon at first. Then, after a moment, it became a birthday table, a cake with uneven icing, and a child clapping in surprise. Another showed a railway platform in the rain. A young woman stood alone beneath a clock, looking anxiously down the tracks. Then a man stepped from a carriage, lifted his hat and smiled. The woman ran to him. The lantern flared bright. Walter lingered there for a moment. The memory made him feel both glad and sad, as good memories sometimes do. Eventually, the cliffs began to steepen. Mist drifted in from the sea. Ahead, on a grassy headland, Walter saw a small stone cottage. It stood alone against the sky, with smoke curling from its chimney and warm light glowing in its windows. A lantern hung above the door. Unlike the others, it burned steady and strong. Walter approached along a narrow path bordered by sea thrift and long wet grass. Before he could knock, the door opened. A woman stood there. She had silver hair pinned loosely at the back of her head, and a face lined by weather and kindness. She wore a dark shawl, and in one hand she held a brass candlestick. "I wondered when you'd arrive," she said. Walter smiled politely. "Good evening. Come in before the mist thickens." The cottage was small but wonderfully comforting. A fire burned in the hearth. Copper pans hung from hooks. A kettle steamed softly on the range. The windows were deep set, and through them Walter could see the lanterns glowing along the coast. The woman placed the candlestick on the table. "I'm Mara Vale," she said. "I keep this cottage and watch the western lights. Walter Bramble." "I know." Walter was not surprised. In book worlds, people often knew one's name before being told. It saved a good deal of explanation. Mara poured tea into 2 blue cups. "You found the journal." Walter placed it on the table. "It found me, I think." "That sounds like Elias." "The lantern keeper?" Mara's expression changed. The warmth remained, but sadness entered it. "Yes. Elias Finch, keeper of the coastal lanterns." Walter sat in the chair by the fire. "What happened to him?" Mara looked towards the window. Outside, the mist moved like pale cloth between the lanterns. "Nobody knows," she said. "One evening he walked east along the cliffs to tend the heart lantern. By morning, he was gone." "The heart lantern," Walter said. "I read about it." "All the lights depend on it," said Mara. "Every lantern on this coast draws from that first flame. If it weakens, the others weaken. If it goes out—" She did not finish. She did not need to. Walter looked through the window. Hundreds of lanterns glowed across the darkening coast. Some shone clearly. Others fluttered in the mist. "So the memories would fade," he said. Mara nodded. "And when a memory fades completely, even the person who carried it may no longer feel its shape." Walter understood. He thought of his own memories, the kitchen of his childhood, the voice of an old teacher, the smell of chalk, a hand on his shoulder, rainy afternoons, books opened for the first time. To lose a memory was not merely to lose a picture. It was to lose a piece of oneself. The journal opened on the table. Fresh words appeared. "The keeper is missing. The heart lantern weakens. The search must begin before dawn." Mara read the words and drew in a quiet breath. "So it has chosen you." Walter touched the page gently. "I suppose it has." Outside, wind brushed against the cottage walls. The fire crackled. The kettle murmured. For a while, neither Walter nor Mara spoke. Then Mara rose and took a lantern from a shelf. It was smaller than the others, made of dark metal with clear glass panels. "You'll need this tomorrow." She placed it beside the journal. "It is a traveling lantern. It will not show you memories, but it may help you find the path between them. Walter examined it. A small flame burned inside, blue at the center and gold at the edges. "Thank you." "You should rest," said Mara. "The coast is longer than it looks." She showed him to a small room at the back of the cottage. It contained a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a patchwork quilt, and a window looking towards the sea. Walter could see the lanterns from there, shining through the mist like patient stars. He removed his shoes, folded his coat over the chair, and placed the journal beside the bed. For a few minutes he sat at the window. The waves moved steadily below the cliffs. The lanterns flickered. Far away, beyond the nearest headland, Walter thought he saw something unusual. A light moving slowly through the mist. Not fixed like the lanterns, not sweeping like a lighthouse. A small traveling light. It glided along the darkness, then vanished. Walter leaned closer to the glass. Nothing. Only mist, only sea. Only the golden chain of lanterns. He opened the journal. The final message of the evening appeared. The keeper is not lost. He is searching too. Follow the moving light. Walter closed the journal and lay down beneath the quilt. The cottage settled around him. The fire crackled in the next room. The sea breathed in the darkness, and along Lantern Coast hundreds of fragile memories kept burning through the night. Chapter 2. The Moving Light. Walter woke to the sound of the sea. For a few moments he did not open his eyes. He simply listened. The waves moved steadily below the cliffs, rising and falling in the darkness beyond the cottage walls. Somewhere nearby, a kettle gave a soft, metallic click as it settled on the range. The wind brushed gently against the window, not howling, not rattling, but breathing, as though the whole coastline were asleep and dreaming. Then Walter remembered. The library, the blue journal, the lanterns, the memories, and the moving light. He opened his eyes. A pale grey dawn filled the small room. His coat hung neatly over the chair where he had left it. The journal lay on the bedside table, closed but not silent. Walter had the distinct impression that it was waiting. He sat up slowly. Outside the window, mist drifted along the cliffs. The lanterns were still burning, though less brightly now that morning had arrived. They looked smaller in daylight, more fragile, like candles after a long night. Walter dressed, folded the patchwork quilt back into place, and picked up the journal. The cover was warm. He opened it. Words appeared at once. Follow the moving light east. Do not hurry. Memories return best to those who walk gently. Walter considered this and nodded. I can manage gently, he said. In the main room, Mara Vale was already awake. She stood by the fire, pouring tea into 2 blue cups. The cottage smelled of toast, sea air, and wood smoke. Good morning, Walter. Good morning. You saw it, didn't you? The moving light? Mara handed him a cup. I did. She looked towards the window. Then the journal is guiding you properly. Walter sat at the small table. Beside his cup lay a plate with toast, butter, and a spoonful of dark red jam. I don't suppose you know what the moving light is, he asked. Mara shook her head. Only rumours. Walter spread butter carefully over his toast. I have found that rumours are sometimes more useful than explanations. Mara smiled faintly. Some say it is Elias himself, carrying a lantern through the mist. Others say it is the memory of Elias, searching for the man he used to be. A few believe it is the heart lantern calling for help. Walter listened quietly. "And what do you believe?" Mara looked into the fire. "I believe Elias Finch would never abandon the lights willingly." Outside, a gull called above the cottage. Mara placed the small travelling lantern from the shelf onto the table. Its flame burned blue at the centre and gold at the edges. "Take this," she said. "If the path disappears, hold it low. If the mist thickens, hold it high. If you are unsure which way to turn, let the flame lean." Walter lifted the lantern by its handle. It was lighter than expected. "Thank you. And take this too." She wrapped a small parcel in brown paper and tied it with string. "Bread, cheese, and an apple. The coast can make a person hungrier than they expect." Walter put the parcel into his coat pocket. "That is very thoughtful." Mara walked him to the door. Beyond the cottage, morning lay grey and quiet over Lantern Coast. The sea was calmer than the day before, though long white lines of foam still moved across the water far below. Walter stepped outside. The air was cold but clean. He turned back. "If I find Elias Finch, I'll bring him home." Mara's expression softened. "Bring him back to himself," she said. "That may be the harder task." Walter thought about this as he followed the path east. The lanterns were different in morning light. Their flames were paler, almost shy. Some barely glowed at all. The travelling lantern swung gently in Walter's hand. After a few minutes, the journal fluttered beneath his arm. He stopped and opened it. "Begin with Lantern 42. Walter looked around. Beside the path stood a lantern whose iron post leaned towards the sea. Small numbers had been engraved into the base. Its flame was hardly visible. Walter touched the frame. At first, nothing happened. Then the travelling lantern gave a small blue flicker. The glass of Lantern 42 cleared. A memory appeared. A young man stood on a harbour wall beneath a stormy sky. He wore a heavy coat and held a sealed letter in one hand. Beside him stood an older woman, perhaps his mother. She pressed something into his palm. Walter could not see what it was at first. Then the image sharpened. A brass button. The young man closed his fingers around it. The older woman touched his cheek. The scene faded. The flame strengthened. Walter stood silently for a moment. The journal opened. Some memories are farewells. Walter walked on. The next lantern was set into a stone wall beside a field of long silver grass. Its memory showed two children lying on their backs in summer, naming shapes in the clouds. One saw a ship, the other saw a sleeping dog. Both insisted they were correct. Walter smiled. The third showed a kitchen table with 3 cups of tea, only 2 people present, and a chair left empty but not forgotten. The fourth showed a man teaching a little girl how to whistle through a blade of grass. Each restored lantern seemed to brighten not only itself, but a small portion of the coast around it. Colours returned to the grass. The sea became clearer. Even the wind felt less cold. By late morning, Walter had reached a narrow valley where the path dipped between 2 cliffs. Mist gathered there more heavily. The travelling lantern flame leaned sharply to the left. Walter followed it. The path descended to a small cove hidden from the main coast. The beach was made of smooth grey stones, and the waves rolled over them with a soft clattering sound. At the far end of the cove stood a lantern almost buried in sand. Walter knelt beside it. The flame inside was nearly gone. He touched the glass. Nothing. He opened the journal. The page remained blank. Walter waited. Still nothing. Then he remembered Mara's words. Memories return best to those who walk gently. Perhaps some memories needed patience. Walter sat on a flat stone beside the lantern and listened. He listened to the waves, to the stone shifting, to the wind moving through the cliff grass. After a while, the travelling lantern glowed warmer. The buried lantern gave the smallest flicker. A memory appeared. At first it was only sound, laughter. Then colour returned. A group of people sat around a small fire on the beach at dusk. Someone played a concertina. Someone else sang softly. A child slept wrapped in a blanket near the firelight. The sea was dark and calm beyond them. The song was too faint for Walter to understand, but it carried a feeling of home. The lantern brightened fully. Walter remained seated a little longer. Some memories, he thought, were like shy birds. They returned only when the world grew quiet enough. He climbed back to the main path. The mist had thickened. Beyond the next ridge, the coastline became wilder. Fewer cottages stood there. The lanterns were spaced farther apart. Some posts were bent by years of wind. Some glass panes were cracked. The journal directed him onward, east, towards the broken bell. Walter wondered what that meant. By midday, he discovered it. A ruined chapel stood on the cliff, roofless and open to the sky. Ivy climbed its walls. In the remains of a stone tower hung a bell split down one side, the broken bell. 3 lanterns stood around the chapel yard. All were dim. Walter entered through a leaning gate. The first lantern showed a wedding. Not grand. No enormous crowd, only a couple standing in the chapel doorway, while rain fell behind them. Their guests held umbrellas. Everyone was laughing because the wind had taken the bride's veil and blown it into a rose bush. The second showed a choir of children singing by candlelight. The third showed an old man sitting alone in the chapel long after everyone else had gone, holding his hat in both hands. This third memory took longest to restore. Walter did not understand it, but he felt its weight. Not all memories were happy. Yet even sad memories seemed to deserve a light. When the third lantern brightened, the cracked bell above him gave a soft tone, only one note, low and gentle. It travelled out across the mist. The journal opened. "You are closer." Walter stepped back onto the path. That was when he saw it. Far ahead, beyond the next headland, a small light moved through the mist. It travelled slowly, bobbing slightly as though carried by someone walking. Walter held up the travelling lantern. Its flame leaned towards the light. "There you are," he said. He followed. The moving light stayed ahead of him, never close enough to reach, never far enough to lose. It led him along a cliff path where the grass was wet and silver. It crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a stream that fell straight down into the sea. It passed through a grove of wind-bent trees whose branches leaned permanently inland. Walter kept a steady pace. He did not hurry. The light seemed to prefer patience. At last the path descended towards a small harbour. No boats moved there. The water was still. Old nets hung from posts. Ropes knocked gently against wooden masts. The houses around the harbour were shuttered and quiet, as though everyone had stepped away only moments before. At the end of the quay stood a tall lantern. Its flame was dark, completely dark. Walter approached slowly. The moving light hovered beside it, then vanished. The harbour became very still. Walter opened the journal. For a long time no writing appeared. Then gradually, Lantern 79. The last memory Elias restored before he disappeared. Walter touched the lantern, cold, No flicker came. He held the travelling lantern close, its blue-gold flame bent towards the dark glass. A faint image appeared, not clear. A man stood on the quay, tall, thin, wearing a long coat. He carried a lantern in one hand and the blue journal in the other. Elias Finch. Walter felt certain of it. The memory trembled. Elias looked out towards the harbour mouth. There was another light there, moving over the water. Elias lifted his lantern and stepped forward. Then the image shattered into darkness. Walter removed his hand. The lantern remained unlit. He tried again. Nothing. The journal opened. This memory is broken. Walter looked out across the harbour. Beyond the still water, mist concealed the sea. "What did you see, Elias?" he murmured. A voice behind him answered. He saw what he had lost. Walter turned. An old fisherman sat on a coil of rope beside a shuttered boathouse. Walter was quite sure he had not been there a moment before. The man wore a thick grey sweater, sea boots, and a cap pulled low over his brow. His beard was white and neatly trimmed. His eyes were pale blue. "Good afternoon," said Walter. The fisherman nodded. "Afternoon. Do you know Elias Finch?" "Knew him. Know him. Hard to say these days." Walter stepped closer. "I'm trying to find him." "Aye. So is he." The answer troubled Walter. The fisherman looked towards the dark lantern. Elias kept everyone else's memories safe, year after year, never complained, never missed a lantern. But he forgot that keepers have memories too. Walter sat on a nearby crate. The fisherman continued. There was one memory he would never tend. His own. Aye. The harbour ropes knocked gently against the posts. "What memory?" Walter asked. The fisherman's face softened. "Long ago, Elias had a brother, Thomas Finch, younger by 7 years. Bright lad, restless, always wanted to sail beyond the Lantern Coast." "What happened?" "One stormy evening, Thomas took a boat out when he shouldn't have. Elias lit every lantern along the shore, but the fog came down thick. Thomas did not return." Walter looked at the dark lantern, and Elias blamed himself. "For more years than I can count." The fisherman nodded towards the sea. When the heart lantern began to weaken, Elias went looking for the one memory he had hidden from himself. He thought if he could restore it, all the lights would strengthen. But he disappeared. He followed the moving light. Walter looked sharply at him. "The same light I followed." "Aye. It appears to those who are searching for what they cannot quite bear to remember." The mist shifted over the harbour. For a moment Walter saw the moving light again, far out near the harbour mouth. The fisherman stood. "If you want Elias, you must follow it across the water." Walter glanced at the still boats. "I'm not much of a sailor." The fisherman smiled faintly. "On Lantern Coast, boats know more than passengers." He pointed to a small wooden rowing boat tied beside the quay. It was painted dark green, with a lantern fixed to its bow. Walter approached it. The boat rocked gently, though the water was almost still. The journal opened in his hands. "Cross before evening. Find the island of the unremembered." Walter looked back. The fisherman had vanished. Only the coil of rope remained. Walter was beginning to find this sort of thing less surprising. He stepped carefully into the boat. The travelling lantern glowed brightly. The rope untied itself. Without oars, without sail, without any visible effort, the boat drifted away from the quay. The dark harbour widened around him. Mist closed behind. Ahead, the moving light waited over the water. Walter sat quietly as the boat carried him towards it. The sea was calm beyond the harbour mouth. The cliffs faded into pale shapes behind him. The lanterns along the coast became a golden chain stretching farther than Walter could see. After some time, the mist thinned. An island appeared. Small, rocky, silent. At its centre stood a single tall lantern, much larger than the others, but unlit. Beside it was a figure, a man in a long coat. He stood with his back to Walter, looking up at the dark lantern. The boat touched the shore. Walter stepped onto the stones. The figure did not turn. Walter knew who it was before he spoke. "Mr. Finch." The man slowly looked over his shoulder. His face was tired and kind. His eyes held the sadness of someone who had carried a memory for too long alone. "You found my journal," he said. Walter nodded. "I think your journal found me." Elias Finch looked towards the dark lantern. "Then perhaps there is still time." The travelling lantern flickered hard in Walter's hand. The journal opened to a final page. "The heart lantern cannot be restored until the keeper remembers." Elias closed his eyes. The mist thickened around the island. Behind them, far across the water, the lights of Lantern Coast began to flicker, one by one. Walter felt the cold pass through the air. The memories were fading. Elias Finch opened his eyes again. "I hoped I would not have to remember it," he said. Walter stood beside him in the grey light. "Perhaps," he said gently, "you do not have to remember it alone." Chapter 3. The Heart Lantern. The island was silent. Mist drifted slowly across the rocks, softening every edge and turning the world into shades of silver and grey. The sea surrounding the island had become almost perfectly still. Walter Bramble stood beside Elias Finch. Neither man spoke for several moments. Above them towered the great lantern. It was larger than any lantern Walter had yet seen. The ironwork rose high above their heads. Its glass panels were clouded. Its flame was dark, not extinguished entirely, but sleeping, waiting. Far away, across the water, Lantern Coast glimmered faintly through the mist. Some lights still burned steadily. Others flickered. A few had already gone dark. Walter watched them carefully. Every one of those lanterns held somebody's memory. A child's laughter, a wedding day, a farewell, a family meal, a song beside a fire. Thousands of moments, thousands of lives, and all of them depended upon the lantern standing before him. The heart lantern. Elias Finch stared at it quietly. His shoulders looked heavy, not with age, with memory. Walter understood the feeling. There were burdens that could not be carried in one's hands, only in one's heart. The journal opened by itself. Fresh words appeared. The keeper remembers all memories except one. The final light cannot burn while the final memory remains hidden. Elias lowered his gaze. "I knew it." Walter said nothing. He sensed that this was a moment for listening. The sea lapped gently against the rocks below. The mist shifted. Elias sat upon a weathered stone near the lantern. For a long time he simply stared out across the water. Then he began to speak. "When I was young, I had a brother." Walter nodded. "Thomas." Elias looked surprised. "You've heard of him?" "A fisherman told me." Elias smiled sadly. "There have always been fishermen who know more than they should." The smile vanished quickly. "Thomas was 7 years younger than me." His voice softened. "He was fearless." The mist drifted around them. Walter listened. "When we were children, we'd sit on the cliffs and watch ships pass beyond the horizon." Elias looked towards the distant sea. "I wanted to tend the lanterns." "And Thomas?" "He wanted to see what lay beyond the horizon." A faint smile returned. "He was always looking beyond things." The lantern keeper fell silent. Walter waited patiently. Eventually, Elias continued. "The night it happened, a storm arrived unexpectedly." His hands tightened. "The worst fog I'd ever seen." The mist around the island seemed to thicken. Walter had the strange feeling that the memory itself was beginning to awaken. Thomas had gone fishing. Elias stared at the rocks beneath his feet. "I begged him not to." The sea seemed quieter now, as though listening. He laughed. A tear appeared in the corner of Elias's eye. He always laughed. Walter looked away politely. Some moments deserved privacy. "I lit every lantern along the coast." Elias's voice shook. "Every single one." The mist changed. Walter suddenly realized they were no longer simply standing beside the heart lantern. The memory had begun surrounding them. The island faded. The sea darkened. Wind rose. Walter found himself standing beside a younger Elias on a cliff path. Rain lashed sideways. Fog swallowed everything. Lanterns glowed desperately through the darkness, one after another. Their golden light pushed against the storm. But the sea remained invisible. The younger Elias ran from lantern to lantern, relighting flames, cleaning glass, checking wicks, searching, always searching. "Thomas!" The cry echoed through the storm. "Thomas!" Only wind answered. The memory shifted. Hours passed. Walter watched the younger lantern keeper searching the coast, again and again, calling, waiting, hoping. The storm continued. The sea offered nothing back. Then dawn arrived. Grey, silent, empty. No boat returned. The memory froze. Everything became still. Walter now understood. Elias had spent years remembering the lanterns, years remembering other people's lives, yet he had refused to remember this. The pain had simply been too great. The storm vanished. The island returned. The heart lantern stood before them once more. Elias sat silently. The memory had exhausted him. Walter lowered himself onto the stone beside him. Neither spoke. The sea rolled gently below. Finally, Walter said, "You did everything you could." Elias looked down. "I know." "Then why blame yourself?" The lantern keeper stared into the mist. "Because if I stop blaming myself," his voice broke slightly, "then I have to accept that I couldn't save him." Walter understood. Many people carried guilt because it felt easier than helplessness. Elias had carried his for years. The journal opened. New words appeared. The memory is not complete. Both men looked down. Another line appeared. Look beyond the storm. Elias frowned. I don't understand. Walter looked towards the heart lantern. Perhaps there's more. The great lantern suddenly gave a faint golden flicker. Its glass brightened. A new image appeared. Not the storm, not the search. Something else. A calm summer evening. Two boys sat on a cliff overlooking the sea. Elias and Thomas, children. The younger Thomas was holding something. A lantern. A tiny handmade lantern. Walter watched. The younger Elias laughed. Thomas held up the lantern proudly. Then he said something. This time they could hear the words, "If I ever get lost, you'll find me." Young Elias laughed. "Of course I will." Thomas shook his head. "No." He pointed at the lantern. "You'll find me because you'll remember me." The image faded. Silence settled over the island. Elias stared at the dark glass. Walter realized what had happened. For years Elias had remembered only the loss, not the life. Only the storm, not the countless happy days before it. Only guilt, not love. The journal fluttered. The lanterns do not preserve loss. They preserve what was cherished. Elias closed his eyes. For the first time since Walter had met him, his expression softened. The years seemed to fall away. Not entirely, but enough. He was remembering Thomas properly. Not the final night. The entire person, the laughter, the adventures, the dreams, the brother. A tear rolled down his cheek. Then something extraordinary happened. The heart lantern ignited. A tiny golden flame appeared at its center, no larger than a candle. Yet immediately Walter felt warmth spread through the air. The flame grew, slowly, steadily. Golden light filled the glass. The ironwork began shining. The island brightened. The mist glowed. Across the sea, distant lanterns flickered back to life. One, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. Golden light spread along Lantern Coast, like sunrise flowing through the darkness. Walter stood and watched. The view was magnificent. Every lantern burned brightly now, every memory secure. The sea itself seemed transformed. The water reflected thousands of points of light, as though the stars had descended onto the waves. Elias stood beside him. His face looked peaceful, perhaps for the first time in many years. I thought remembering would hurt. Walter smiled gently. Sometimes it does. Elias nodded. But it doesn't hurt the way I expected. No. Walter watched the lanterns. Memories are strange things. The keeper looked towards him. They become lighter when shared. Elias smiled. The journal opened one final time. Its pages turned rapidly, then stopped. The final message appeared. The lights are restored. The keeper remembers. The coast remembers. Thank you, Walter Bramble. The words slowly faded. The pages became blank. The wind changed. Walter recognized the sensation immediately. The adventure was ending. The island softened. The lanterns blurred. The sea became mist. The mist became light, and the light became shelves. Bookshelves. Tall shelves. Old shelves. Library shelves. Walter blinked. He was sitting in the armchair beside the gallery window. Rain tapped gently against the glass. The library was exactly as he had left it. The journal rested on his lap, closed, silent, ordinary, or almost ordinary. Walter stood. He looked around. Everything felt wonderfully familiar. The gallery, the shelves, the lamps, the distant murmur of readers below. The journal no longer felt warm. Its task was finished. Walter returned it carefully to the shelf where he had found it. The dark blue cover seemed slightly brighter than before. Perhaps he imagined it. Perhaps not. As he turned to leave, he noticed something. The tiny lantern embossed on the cover was glowing faintly, just for a moment. Then it faded. Walter smiled. He descended the staircase. The librarian looked up from her desk. Find a good book? Walter considered the question. I think it found me. The librarian nodded as though this made perfect sense. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds. The wet streets sparkled. Walter began the short walk home. Tomorrow he would return. Tomorrow another book would be waiting somewhere among the shelves. Another story, another adventure, another door. But for now, he simply enjoyed the afternoon sunshine and the comforting knowledge that somewhere beyond ordinary sight, along a distant coastline lined with lanterns, thousands of precious memories continued to glow safely through the night. The end